Okay, hi there. It's 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon. Welcome to our short revision clinic. Thanks for dropping in. The aim of this session is to field some questions. We won't be question spotting, but the idea is just to be able to clarify points for you. If you have questions on tricky concepts or topics, I'll try and do my best for you. I've also got a little session just to start the clinic by just working through a few key points I really want to focus on in this the last night before the exam. So let's start with that. And as we go through, we'll be looking at your questions, we'll be picking them out, putting them on the screen. We won't be able to reply to all of them, but we'll just do our best over the next 30 minutes or so. Quantitative skills. So these will be tested in paper 1, 2, and 3. Of course, they have to be. Just a couple of quick reminders for you. First of all, please write down the formula. If you get a question on elasticity of supply, put the formula down to start with. There's credit for that, as well as showing your working. Please do that. Even if you get the wrong answer, then you'll be credited. You get some marks. People can make mistakes in calculations. That's the way it is. But put the formula down, please. Show your working, and you'll get some credit. The other key point, I think, with quantitative skills is please be precise. So a couple of things. If the answer says 2 decimal places, give it to 2 decimal places, and that's what the question is asking. Secondly, include the units. Okay, and if needed, the sign of the change. So, for example, if it's profits and it's in dollars, you have to put dollars. If it's an elasticity, you need to put the coefficient of elasticity in there. If it's a percentage change, if it's a minus, if it's a fall, you have to put the minus sign in there. These are tiny little points, but they can make a difference. The odd mark here and there, and obviously that has a big effect on your grade going forward. Okay, a couple of words about diagrams. I think this is quite interesting this year. So the examiners have been quite clear ahead of the 2022 papers. They are looking for developed diagrams. I've got a few examples to show you in a second to help you get those higher analysis marks. So diagrams actually, diagram is essentially part of knowledge. Knowing how to draw a diagram is part of the skill, isn't it? But crucially, you can use your diagrams for application by adapting them in response to the context. So if you're talking about a particular industry or a particular market, it could be the housing market, for example, or it could be the market for electric vehicles, it could be the market for energy and gas. Make sure that your diagram is contextualized. You're talking about the price of gas, you're talking about the supply curve of electric cars, that kind of thing, tiny things, but they make a big difference in the exam. Most important point is please don't regard diagrams and text as separate entities. You must try to integrate your diagrams into your analysis, into your written analysis. A nice phrase to use, for example, is "as my analysis diagram shows," because that immediately prompts the examiner to go look at the diagram and then give it a good grade, good mark, because it's part of the analysis. And you can also use diagrams in your evaluation points, particularly a developed diagram. So you may not have much time to draw lots of diagrams in the exam. Your exam board will give you details on that, but crucially, a developed diagram just helps the evaluation as well, naturally. I just want to give you a couple of examples of that on the next slide, actually. So if we look at this diagram, this was a diagram about, I think it was a question on the sugar tax or something, a tax on high sugar food or high salt food. It's fine, it looks okay. I'm sure you could pick out some issues here. First of all, it's not contextualized. What is being taxed here? What is the product? What is the price? Quantity of what? That's a moot point. Secondly, it's not developed. So although the diagram is showing the supply plus tax and the price going up from P1 to P2 and quantity contracting to Q2, that's fine. It's not developed. It's not showing, for example, the tax revenue that goes to the government. It's not showing the incidence of the tax. That would help you get to a next level. You could develop the diagram by showing the impact on consumer surplus and producer revenues. So one of the points I was making in the live streams just a couple of days ago on contestable markets, on monopoly, if you can draw the demand curve to the y-axis, because then that allows you to bring in consumer surplus into your answer, and that lifts your mark tomorrow to a higher level. You might want to develop the diagram by changing the elasticity of demand. So I've got one demand curve there, which is pretty inelastic. Maybe if you tweaked the elasticity, perhaps a separate diagram, who knows, you would be developing the diagram. So the one point I want to get across today when it comes to diagrams is they matter, they clearly matter, but try to develop the diagram. Don't just draw something that's perfunctory and kind of half-hearted. They really do make a difference. Quite a few examiners, by the way, look at diagrams first before they look at your written answer, because they kind of get a feel for what the answer is going to be. If your diagrams are superb, it'll reinforce the fact that your paper is going to be tremendous. Here's another good example for you. So this is a good example of what I mean by a developed diagram. Let's take a moment on this one, if that's okay with you. The question was, discuss the impact of using soybean subsidies on economic agents in Brazil. Really good question. Sort of market failure stroke development question in a way, but using micro. Really good example of a developed diagram here, which shows the negative externalities from production. It shows a deadweight loss of ABC. It then shows the marginal private costs falling because of a subsidy, which increases the deadweight loss to AED. It's really good. I mean, that is a high quality diagram. You won't see much better than that at A level this year. I'm sure you'll be practicing your diagrams ahead of tomorrow. You don't need to use a ruler in the exam. You just need to be freehand, clean, clear, draw to the axes, and that's a really good diagram. Okay, so diagrams. Next slide. Just want to spend a couple of minutes with you, literally a couple of seconds, if it's okay with you, just talking about language in the exams. So when your examiners receive your scripts tomorrow night or Tuesday, whatever it is, the precise use of terminology, appropriately, consistently used, shows great knowledge. That's important. But if you can give precise detail, you'll be getting better analysis and better evaluation marks as well. So the language is really important. Obviously, things like using connectives, key terms accurately defined if they're in the question, for example. That's important. A couple more things just from me before we get into questions. The next slide shows helpful word types. We actually covered this in our grade booster sessions. We had some fantastic students in the revision sessions in the cinemas, and we've got loads more videos now built into our grade booster, AQA and Edexcel Economics, if you want to have a look at those courses on the website. So these are helpful word types. Connectives, hugely important in your building chains of reasoning. So therefore, as a result, inconsequently, in turn, just those phrases help to build connectives. They're little tiny things, but they do make a difference. Hedging words. These words are used to indicate that you recognize there are different views, different viewpoints, different perspectives in economics. So typically, sometimes might. The word might instead of will and must is essential. Evaluative words, however, conversely, in practice, on balance, they give the examiner a little hint you're about to evaluate. And structural words, flag up things. Firstly, my second point is, for instance, overall, how you start a paragraph tomorrow will matter. And you can sometimes structure your answer quite nicely just using these simple words. And just to round off, thinking a little bit about application and analysis, the best answers, there's no question about this, the best answers, be they data response or essays, connect theory with examples. So obviously in the data response questions, you must use the extracts. Now my specialism is Edexcel. I have taught AQA in the past, but that's conscious of that this afternoon. I'm an Edexcel teacher. I've told my students quite clearly, in a data response question, they have to use the extracts in every paragraph. There must be at least one application point in each paragraph. That has to be. Because otherwise, if there isn't, you won't get the marks for application. So please do integrate examples and evidence into your answers. You don't need a lot, but it needs to be there. And please avoid generic answers. Just avoid time lags and avoid whatever, That's old style economics. You need to be at a higher level than that. Just moving on to the next slide, almost with you. Features of effective evaluation. Okay, a lot of students get worried about are they evaluating properly. The key thing really is to evaluate your preceding point. So split up your analysis and the evaluation into separate paragraphs. I always strongly advise leaving 2 lines between each paragraph so the examiner can read it more easily. So focus on the preceding point, try to evaluate the point you just made. Evaluation is not just about trying to destroy an argument or take something to bits. It doesn't have to be like that. Evaluation can just be quite gentle and subtle, just unchallenging the assumptions you've made. Just reading the chat before the session started, a lot of people saying, do we need to know about rational decision making? The answer is yes, but challenging the idea that consumers are rational, challenging the idea that firms are profit maximizers, is unpicking the assumptions. And that's really good evaluation if you do that. Considering different stakeholders. If you get a question on minimum wage, which people are affected by it? Which people are directly impacted by it? Workers, employees, businesses, but which businesses? And if you can, evaluation is about using data to support your point. The best answers tomorrow, the best answers will have some application, a bit of data. Good use of terminology, yes. Chains of reasoning, just like analysis. And whenever you're concluding or you're making judgments, that is evaluation. And you'll know ahead of your paper tomorrow what your exam board wants in terms of the final conclusions and so on. So there we go. That was just a very quick 10-minute overview from me. I'm now going to turn to the live chat. I have shaved off most of my hair, by the way, just because it's a special occasion. So I'll do my best. And apologies, by the way, if there's too much of a glare. Here's the first one from Shira. By the way, we're going to pick out some questions. Sorry, we won't be able to do all of them. We'll just do the best we can. For the diagram, we got told not to make our diagram too complicated. How can we get an application marks? Because when it begins to get messy. Great point. Yeah, well, it's about practice, isn't it? My strong advice, by the way, is to draw a diagram that's at least half a side of A4, which gives you space to draw your diagram. You don't want to make it too complicated, but this is an A-level exam. So most students tomorrow will be using cost and revenue curve analysis, and particularly when it comes to market structures. So the diagrams at A-level are, they're pretty hard at times. I think you're right though, with supply and demand diagrams particularly, don't try and overcomplicate. Just do the basics well and you'll be in great shape. So thank you for that question. VAV 21. Can you use your own knowledge with the data questions for application as well? The answer is yes. You'll always be credited for doing that. But VAV 21, thank you for your question. In the data response questions, you definitely need to use the extracts first. Tomorrow you're taking a data response paper, not a data completely ignore paper. So please use the extracts, and ideally you read through the extracts, read the questions first, and then go back to the extracts and really work hard on a quick highlighting of those. Here's another question coming up on the screen. Let's choose one. Jack Wilson says, you said about time lags being too generic. Is there any other evaluation points you say are generic? Great point. Yes. Okay. So yeah, it depends on elasticity. So for example, let me give you, here's a good example. You might get a question, AQA, by the way, looks like labour markets are going to feature heavily. You might get a question, examine the effect or assess the effects of an increase in the minimum wage on the labour market, on employment. Well, clearly, the impact on employment does depend on elasticity, but you need to develop it. So you would say, for example, the minimum wage has gone up by 6.6% this year to £9.50 per hour. The impact on the minimum wage on employment depends on the wage elasticity of demand for labour. So you're making it more precise. For example, if the wage elasticity of demand is 0.5, a 10% rise in the minimum wage might lead to a 5% fall in employment. And hopefully, Jack, that gives you the difference between generic, it depends on the elasticity, and something that's both specific, wage elasticity of demand for labour, as well as a little bit of application. I mean, you're making the numbers up by saying it's 0.5, but that's the difference between generic and developed, more subtle evaluation. So thanks for your question. Andy Smith says, when labelling the x-axis on any diagram, can you put output instead of quantity demanded, or will you lose marks? Great question. I think if you're talking about a market or an industry or a firm, cost and revenue curves, Andy, you would probably put output, and it could be output of pharmaceuticals, output of energy. If you're using supply and demand diagrams, I'd put quantity. Here's another question. So what we're trying to do is we're filtering. My brother Jim is doing a great job as producer, filtering some questions. And here's Eddie's question. Eddie White asks, diagrammatically, how would you internalize a positive externality using either a tax or a subsidy? Okay, so Eddie, here I'm thinking about a positive externality in consumption. For example, a vaccine, which healthcare could well feature on the papers tomorrow. If you can visualize this with me, Eddie, you've got the marginal social benefit lying above the private benefit. You've got an output that's below the social optimum, so you're trying to encourage consumption. So the government might subsidize the producers so that the marginal private cost of production goes down, which then moves you down the demand curve towards the social optimum output. So typically a subsidy to the producer would help internalize the externality, or you could offer a direct subsidy to the consumer, which effectively increases their demand, which can achieve the same thing. Thinking aloud there, just in terms of positive externalities, I'm not question spotting, won't do that, but healthcare economics could well feature environmental economics, healthcare economics. The papers were set probably late spring, early summer of last year. I mean, certainly over a year ago. They will have been tested and tweaked given events since, but most papers were set in 2021. And they can't ask questions about the pandemic or other events, but you're certainly encouraged to show your awareness of what's been happening in the last year or two in terms of that. But I think hopefully, if the exam board are kind tomorrow, there'll be some nice topical questions to do with businesses and industries that have been affected by the pandemic, by the recession that went with it. So I've been doing a series of industry profiles. I think Jim might be able to post a link maybe in the chat onto the industry profiles at some point. But I've covered things like water, telecoms, parcel deliveries, cinemas, airlines, food delivery services. There's lots of industries that the dynamic has really changed in the last couple of years. Let's try and see if we can put another question on the screen. I'm doing my best. Apologies, by the way, if I can't answer them all. What I will do, that, by the way, as I'm doing my own revision session with my students tonight, but later on this evening, probably from 7 till 9, I'm going to be going into the YouTube channel and just answering as many questions as I can. So please do post a comment or a question, and I'll do my best, and maybe link to resources. Barry's Tech. Sounds like you're running a business there, Barry. What are the best diagrams to know and adapt? Wow, how long have you got? For me, externalities diagrams, market failure diagrams, absolutely pivotal. And for me, government intervention diagrams are key. Actually, Jim, if we can bring up on the screen some of the government interventions, and maybe it was the last slide I had on the presentation. I think I might have finished this presentation. There we go. So I was asking my students the other day, what kind of interventions do you want to talk about? Indirect taxes and subsidies? Yes. Pollution permits, maximum prices. And I basically said to the student, look, can you draw a diagram for each? Well, not certainly for each, but certainly for many of them. Indirect taxes, subsidies, permits, the tradable permit system, maximum prices in markets, minimum prices, buffer stocks, regulations, carbon taxes, and things like information economics. So to answer the question, if we go back to the question, please, Jim, those will be really key. Government intervention, massively important. And then, Barry, looking at the exam boards, certainly with Edexcel, oligopoly, monopoly, contestable markets, it looks like AQA in particular has gone large on all the market structures apart from perfect competition, opposite competition. So price discrimination, monopoly, oligopoly, contestable markets, and labour market diagrams clearly. So I would go market failure, government intervention, theory of the firm, market structures, and labour markets. 521 is back again. Can you use your own knowledge with the data questions for application as well? I think we had that question, maybe. And the answer is yes. So you will always be credited in using your own information, but please use the extracts first. Okay, another question from Vedatri. Okay, have they got the name right? Would you get marked down for using wrong figures? If I said the minimum wage is around £9, that's all right. It's absolutely right. The exam boards will not be employing fact checkers like they do for Boris Johnson in Question Time and Keir Starmer. If you say the minimum wage is £9, it's £9. It is actually, it's about £9.50. You just need to be careful. I mean, somebody said to me this morning, can I just make up hypothetical application on the spot and get full marks? I mean, technically the answer is probably yes. A little knowledge goes so well, doesn't it? That having just a little bit of application you can feed into the answer. If you were to say, for example, China's entry into the European Union has been problematic, or whatever, the decision to introduce a carbon tax of $3 million per tonne in the UK is causing higher costs. It's clearly wrong. Don't worry, please, and this is a wider message. We've got nearly 1,000 people in the chat at the moment. Please don't be worried about getting everything right tomorrow. Certainly with the data of the application, your examples, that's not what the exam's about. It's helpful to add in and feed in good application. And you won't get a good grade without it, by the way. I think the exam boards this year would be ruthless if you don't include application in your answers. But you don't have to do a lot of application. Just a little application is all you need, and you'll be fine. We've had that question from Eddie, so let's move on to another question here. Loads coming through. By the way, I will go through as many as I can. If you post a question in the comment section, I promise to go through them. Evan Carter asks, is the King demand curve, in the King demand curve, can you just draw two elasticities and not draw MR/MC? Great question, Evan. Yes, you can. But for the full analysis marks, you would need AR, MR, and MC. So I would go for the full diagram. Otherwise, you're basically just drawing a different elasticities on. That's all you're doing, which is fine. It's a bit like just drawing a simple supply and demand diagram. Do you remember the one we showed 10 minutes ago with that nice inelastic demand, and it showed the tax, didn't it? It's perfectly fine. But it wasn't a developed diagram, which is what's needed for top marks in the exam. Max Roberson says, how lenient are they with evaluation? Because sometimes evaluation isn't in the mark scheme. Max, you've hit on a really important point. And many people today, this evening, tomorrow morning, for sure, will be reading through mark schemes and just comparing their model answers, their practice questions with the mark scheme. Don't worry about that. Let me just take a sip of water, please. Don't worry about that, Max. The mark schemes are adjusted after the exam to take into account perfectly valid evaluation points that students have brought into their answers. And there's a bit of toing and froing, and examiners will contribute to the mark scheme. So if the evaluation is fine, it's relevant to the question, and it's well developed with a chain of reasoning, you will be credited. Don't worry about that. Not the mark scheme is just a shadow of what can be written. And keep in mind, we've got thousands of students taking the exam tomorrow, first paper of 3, and they know a lot of economics. Believe me, the students I've been meeting and helping are absolutely bang on this, right? And they're producing good economics, or the best economics they can, and a lot of the answers will not be on the mark scheme, but they will be credited. So don't worry about that. Damola says, for oligopolistic markets, would you recommend shoeing the kink demand curve or just discussing it? Ooh, shoeing it, kicking it down the pathway. I would be using it. Now, look, if you're Edexcel, I don't know if you're Edexcel or AQA or OCR, Damola, but if you're Edexcel, you don't need it. But I would be using it, and you'll be credited for using it, because I think the kink demand curve is quite an interesting model. It's not perfect, it's flawed, but it does suggest, by the way, that firms can settle on a kind of price output equilibrium, and there might be little incentive to move from that. So sticky prices then leads to a focus on non-price competition. So I wouldn't show it anywhere. I'd have it in my toolbox and I'd bring it out if the question asked for it. Jamie asked a nice question. Which graph should we draw for carbon credits? Negative externality or supply and demand? Jamie, that is a great question. My answer is actually both. For carbon credits, you'd be using supply and demand diagrams, because you're trying to show, if I just use my pen here, you're trying to show how the supply of permits shifts to the left. And as a result, the market price of permits goes up. And of course, that depends on the elasticity of demand for carbon permits, of course. But I think you'd be using a supply and demand diagram because you're trying to show the way the market is working to drive up the price of permits, which then causes a change in behavior. For example, airlines might have to buy more permits, or some sort of incinerator plant increase costs. Before that, before you draw the permits diagram, you've probably drawn an externalities diagram, haven't you? Because you're trying to show the market failure, which then prompts the intervention. But you could build the carbon permits diagram into your analysis, because of course it increases the marginal private cost of emitting pollution. Although actually for externalities diagrams, it's probably a little easier to show a carbon tax than carbon permits using that diagram. Hope that answered your question. Rose has a lovely question. How many diagrams should we use in an answer? One per paragraph or multiple per paragraph? Oof. Rose, thank you for that. My strong advice to my students is don't overuse diagrams. Normally, one, possibly two developed diagrams are absolutely fine. You may not have time to do that. But in a 25 marker, you could easily get 2 great diagrams out. I don't want to upset people here, but some of my students are drawing, if they're doing 15 marker or 25 marker, for example, they know the diagram they want to draw, and they're drawing it first. So they're drawing the diagram first, half a side of A4, developed diagram, because they can then refer straight back to it in their answer, their written answer, in their paragraphs, chains of reasoning, without having to write the chain of reasoning, thinking, well, what am I going to draw? So sometimes draw the diagram first if you know what you need to do, then write your chain of reasoning that basically links to it and embeds it in the answer. So you don't need many diagrams. I think sometimes less is more in an exam, particularly if the diagrams are good, as I showed you a couple of examples before. There's a perfectly elastic supply here of amazing questions. Let's take a few more. We're conscious of time. The football starts in half an hour. My team are hoping to beat Burnley this afternoon. Gabriella says, can we use functions similar to the price mechanism for labour demand to analyse why shifting demand increases wages? Yes, you can. Really good. Really good. Labour market dynamics, I think with the labour market, It's basically supply and demand, isn't it? Essentially, you'd be using that and elasticities of demand and supply for labour. People were saying in the chat beforehand, really supporting each other in terms of explaining factors affecting elasticity of labour supply, for example. The one diagram that's quite complicated is the monopsony diagram. So I know that AQA students will be bang on that. At Excel students, probably more paper 3 than paper 1, I guess. So you can indeed use functions similar to the price mechanism for labour demand. Okay, Jim's selecting another question. Eddie Campbell, what's the best way to get AO3 marks? Pause here, AO3 marks analysis. Well, okay, the key thing is to use chains of reasoning and use economic concepts of the level that you need. Actually, that's a great question. I'm sure this won't happen tomorrow, but a lot of students, in the pressure of the exam, they fall back on slightly simpler analysis than they would be normally doing in a class essay, for example. So students who might in a class essay be quite happy drawing cost and revenue diagrams in a monopoly, for example, fall back on supply and demand because they have a little moment in the exam and think, oh, I better just get the basics down correctly. The key is to keep the analysis at a high level, a very high level, if you can. Good use of concepts, accurate use, precise use of concepts and diagrams, and chains of reasoning to link your argument together. How harshly, if at all, Daniel says, if at all, will it be penalized for reusing chains of analysis for different points as part of their sets of chains? Okay, so yes, for example, at Excel, you only ever need 2 paragraphs of analysis. And sometimes people say the second paragraph can be a bit samey. They feel like they're writing something similar. So that's partly just finding points of difference in your argument. If you're using cost and revenue curves and demand curves, sometimes there are similar links in the chain. I wouldn't worry too much about that, Daniel. Actually, if your economics is solid and sound, and if you're good at using good application, that will help differentiate your paragraphs. So don't worry too much. I mean, chains of reasoning, connective words are very similar across all paragraphs. Don't worry about it. Stick to what you've been preparing and practicing for your exam. If your teachers think that's fine, you'll be fine because they are not only experts, but they have your best interests at heart. Colleague 52, what's the best way to structure a conclusion? Great question. Again, depends which exam board you're studying. I quite like students who just take a step back at the end of an essay. So for example, let me just see if I can find a topic for you. Yeah, okay. So let's say, for example, you get a question on contestable markets, just for the sake of argument. To what extent are contestable markets good for the consumer? You built your analysis, you built your evaluation, and you're looking to conclude. Well, the obvious point is that you can do a time perspective. So, are contestable markets good for the consumer in the short run versus the long run? Are they good in terms of prices, in terms of consumer surplus and things, but also critically in terms of investment by firms? So firms aren't making the same profit. Do they have money to invest in networks and things going forward? A really good approach in a conclusion is just to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. So, for example, yes, here's one. Should the government be subsidizing renewable energy, both producers of industrial solar panel farms as well as consumers? Well, there's arguments for and against subsidies. You will have built those into your answers. The wider the conclusion is to step back and say, well, what happens if we don't subsidize renewable energy? Will the market provide enough renewable energy of its own accord? Because sometimes the biggest government failure is not to intervene itself. So if you think about all the climate change policies that people are thinking about, and of course the Australian election yesterday was a good case in point. If you believe in the market mechanism, fine, there's less scope for intervention. But in terms of climate change policies, what are the implications of not intervening or intervening too late in a market? So those kind of things can come into a conclusion. You can just take a little step back and look at the bigger picture and say, well, on balance, overall, in the long run, we have to intervene. But the question is, which intervention is most effective? If you criticise one intervention, always bring an alternative in. So you've got a nice balance between policy. And the other really nice approach in conclusions is just to challenge assumptions. My analysis has been built on this assumption, but if we challenge the assumption, we get a different result. That's a good approach. Oh yes, the other one is that no single intervention on its own is likely to achieve the aims that you set. So in terms of your question there, Cully, often you need a multiple number of interventions. You need a mix of interventions on both the demand and supply side to have a genuinely impactful consequence in the market. I'm going to keep going, everybody, for about another 5 minutes, conscious of time, because your time is valuable, hugely valuable. And we have the most important question coming in. It comes in from Josh. As a Newcastle fan, what are your realistic expectations for next season? What would you be happy with? Well, thanks, Josh, for that. Something is happening at Newcastle, by the way. Something quite remarkable is about to happen. And it would not surprise me if we finish in the top 6 next year. Thank you, Josh.
Jeff, I think we're done. Our time is up, unfortunately. So do you want to say some final words?
Yeah, well, Jim, thanks for posting the questions. We had amazing questions. I will go into the, if it's okay with you, Jim, I'll go into the YouTube comments later on this evening and answer as many questions as I can. So if you have particular questions on particular topics, let me know and I'll try and answer them. I'll also maybe post some links to revision resources. Most of all, I just want to wish everybody well. You put a huge amount of time into revision. I know how hard people are working for these papers. Working hard and you're working smart. So I hope it goes well. Keep in mind, everybody, when you turn that exam paper over, it will be a shock. Either a positive shock or a slightly less one, but it will be a surprise. It's the shock of the new. Take a moment, plan your answers, read the extracts, and just give yourself a little bit of time before you get cracking. Keep an eye on the clock. That's really important. And just stay calm and focused. You'll be fine. You haven't been through GCSEs. There's been a big gap between exams. The standard at A-level is not as high as people think it has to be to get the top grades. So if you produce a solid paper tomorrow, that gives you a great platform for paper 2, paper 3, and you'll be able to move into half term with confidence. Okay, Jim?
Superb. Yeah. So when this session finishes, obviously the YouTube video will be there. The live chat won't be there, but that's the time, if you'd like to add your questions in the comment section of the live stream replay, if you see what I mean. That way they'll be there, easy to reply to, and you can see, you'll be able to get a notification if you get a reply. So that's the way to do it once this session finishes. Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that. And by the way, if you've enjoyed the session, found it useful, please give it a like on YouTube to help the YouTube algorithm get all confused ahead of the economics exams. Good luck to all your favourite football teams this afternoon. And more importantly, good luck tomorrow. Cheers.
Take care.